Hey folks, thanks for watching. I thought I would start the video today just with a quick recap of the last 30 days of precipitation, kind of the pattern that we've been seeing. We've been talking, really over the last 3 to 4 weeks about the onset of this drought here across the Ohio River Valley. You could draw this anywhere from like southern Iowa up into Pennsylvania. At times this stretched down into the lower Mississippi River Valley. We had some rain here of late, but that went over dry at the end of summer. But really stretching all the way over to the mid-Atlantic, West Virginia, through even like North Carolina into Virginia, up into New England. I mean, it's been an impressive expanse of these kind of precipitation deficits that have settled in. At times we've had quite a bit of flow, an air mass source region coming out of Canada, so like this, bringing that cooler air with it over the last 4 weeks or so. But it's been cooler as well. We've felt those cool temperatures. We've had better precipitation over the Central Plains. At times we had these little low pressure systems move through the upper Midwest. But even that precipitation, I mean, if you look closely, it's been spotty. There's a number of dry acres and counties in here, including parts of Montana, the Dakotas, northern Minnesota as well, which has gone over a little bit dry here of late. So really you have to go all the way over into the plains, maybe the southern plains, portions of the southeast near the Appalachians to find precipitation surpluses. And then at times we had the monsoon come on late here, certainly in California. We talked about all the thunderstorms that they had there, some of the re-fire starts that pick back up again, Nevada, California, Idaho, Oregon, the lower Colorado River Valley here stretching through Arizona and through Southern California has gone over wet here just kind of over the last few weeks. But that has been the story, and the monsoon in the west has been at times influenced by this heat that we've seen build into Canada, build into the Northwest. I mean, how often over the last 4 weeks we saw bright colors, extreme heat warnings, heat advisories, etc. up in Washington, and then wildfire concerns as a result of that. If we just look at the pattern averaged, I did August 6th through September 6th, looking at those 500 millibar heights, and you can see that ridge here I was just talking about over Canada, bringing that heat into northwest or western Canada, into the northwest U.S., those extreme heat warnings here. This was a flow regime that, as we got through August, talked about being more ideal for bringing that moisture return up into the western U.S. in the form of that monsoon that we saw across the southwest, the severe thunderstorm warnings, the dust storms through the Phoenix area. And then in the east, we had this trough. And that's what brought that kind of cooler, drier Canadian air mass out of the prairie and into the central and eastern U.S., where we were cool but dry for much of the last 4 to 5 weeks or so. And that's really the pattern that we've kind of been dealing with. We'll talk about where we're going in the forecast, which is kind of important to take a step back and see where we've been. I was looking at this composite map here, just the 500 millibar height anomalies. You can kind of see we were drawing the flow around that. And it reminded me of a image we were looking at the end of July in one of our forecast videos here that we put together of an analog of 2022, 24, 2011, 99, 1976. We were kind of comparing these dry fall analogs with some of the sea surface temperatures that we saw, recently this year in 2025. There's my, face at the time staring at this, trying to figure out, if this was worth believing in. And it's actually interesting, there are similarities, that ridging over the Northwest, over Canada, that troughing in the East. It's not exact, especially if you're here kind of on the coast of British Columbia. Those are two very different flow regimes in that area specifically. But by and large, across the U.S., with the heat here, the cool here, the drier in between, that analog didn't do too poorly in August. We'll see about September and October, or at least if this kind of analog sticks around, we're likely to maybe at some point shift back into cooler weather, maybe drier weather for this area, unfortunately. Again, we're going to take a look at that maybe closer to the end of this video when we look out into the seasonal perspective. But as a retrospective on August, I thought that analog was interesting. We just kind of catch us up to present day. If we look at September 8th precipitation, that's just over the last 24 hours. By and large, pretty quiet across much of the continental U.S. Florida, some showers and thunderstorms there, some showers getting into Oregon, Northern California, parts of Washington. But really, man, look at the impressive, very isolated precipitation amounts that were recorded in central Kansas. I mean, that's getting up into like 10 inches plus on our color bar. The north central portions of the state, these storms actually turned southwest, and some supercells developed again near that panhandle region of Oklahoma. This brought all sorts of hazards here. We saw, mega hail. You just like search hail on Twitter, like I did this morning. You can get pictures. This was in Kansas near Ashland. I mean, that's grapefruit, softball, what have you, maybe even a little bit bigger. That is an impressive stone and one you would not want to be outside for. These storms were impressive. I'm going to take us back to like yesterday afternoon. You can see all that rain that was falling in north central Kansas, prompting those large amounts. Through the afternoon, you see these cells develop further to the southwest. Watch this one here. The mean flow over these storms was out of the northwest, pushing them this way. You can see that just in how that initial cluster starts to move to the southeast. But see this one here? Notice how it moved, southwest like that instead of southeast, despite the mean flow over the storm going like that. I mean, you can see the anvil plumes being blown toward the southeast. That is what we call deviant motion or right motion of the supercells, where they actually turn to the right of the flow. So in that case, it would be turning to the right that way of the flow. And that's indicative of a supercell. Those tend to produce our greater severe concerns. And we saw hail reports in this area, tornadoes. If you recorded, just search tornado as well. So neat rope tornado there. There's that impressive supercell from some of these excellent storm chasers here. So very isolated in nature, but neat to see those supercells. In September, I've been talking about things like that since it feels like May or June. If we just look at the radar here this morning, you can see some of those overnight storms still kind of lingering along the Missouri River near Omaha and through eastern Kansas near Kansas City. Maybe a little bit stronger of a line there. I don't think that's warned here this morning, but we can jump over into the all hazards. Oh, that is the old one from yesterday. Yeah, not warned here this morning, but you can see the flash flood warnings and advisories lingering from all that rain the day before. Prompting those storms over Kansas and some of that precipitation over the Central Plains getting out into eastern Kansas, eastern Iowa, or western Iowa, I should say, is this upper level trough that's situated now kind of over Eureka, California, maybe even getting closer to San Francisco here. That's given just enough flow over the Continental Divide, over the Rockies, to help prompt some of those storms to fire in the lee side there over Kansas, over western Oklahoma, even getting into North Texas at times yesterday. And it's really this trough that's going to be slowly pushing across California into the Intermountain West by get to this weekend and starting to peel back up into the northern plains. And I'm not going to call this a big weather maker because it doesn't look to be the case right now, but it is maybe our only weather maker over the next 7 days, which isn't going to be terribly too intense with respect to what precipitation and kind of severe weather that we see. Look at those high temperatures here forecast from the National Weather Service today. You can see the trough, the influence being felt across California, Nevada, Oregon, bringing those high temperatures down into the 80s or 70s. For those states there, the heat starting to return back to Montana, the Dakotas, the Central Plains on Tuesday. But as that trough inches further across the west into the central part of the country, you see the heat expanding by Thursday into the 80s, even 90s for portions of the central U.S., getting up into the Midwest, 90s through Texas, still cooler along the Carolina and Atlantic coast. Man, look at Friday. Rebounding well back into the 90s for a number of areas in Iowa, Missouri, Illinois. High 80s beyond that in the eastern Corn Belt and the northern Corn Belt. I mean, that is an impressive return to summer-like warmth for mid-September. We saw the hints of this in the model runs, even as early as early September, and we're seeing it come to fruition here. That continues through Saturday and Sunday. And don't see a lot that's going to kick out some of this warmer weather with cooler weather in the extended forecast. We'll look at that in a second, but see the west, even through the 7-day forecast at this point, staying on the cooler side with thanks to that trough there. If we jump over and look, this is just a 3-kilometer NAM watching the radar here, the simulation from this morning. You can see some of those showers correctly identified from the 3-kilometer NAM, some trying to form here across Minnesota, Wisconsin, questionable thunder coming out of some of these probably right now here this morning. But those weakening as we go through the day into this afternoon, maybe some of those showers holding on in the Mississippi River, and then potentially additional thunderstorms forming here, western Kansas, like Ulysses is down here, very small town, the panhandle of Texas. You can see those supercells stretching through there, maybe up in the sandhills of western Nebraska, but not widespread coverage here, even across the Central Plains or the Midwest here today. If we go into tomorrow on Wednesday, watching, waiting, there's that trough. You can see it positioned here, plenty of precipitation chances here across portions of Oregon, getting into the Willamette Valley, perhaps the Snake River Valley tomorrow. Wednesday evening up into Montana, but not seeing much in the central or eastern part of the country. You can just see some showers here over Virginia, maybe West Virginia. Even getting out into early Thursday. Again, just don't see much. If we kind of jump over, this was, I think, the last run of the 3-kilometer NAM. That's why I jumped over to the different one. But even if I take that forecast out in the future, just some kind of sporadic shower activity here. That's some of that stuff forming here this morning over Florida. Most of that precipitation staying out west can still see, by and large, dry across the middle part of the country. If you want to see some of that precipitation get off the Continental Divide, start really kind of racing into at least the central, maybe the upper Midwest, you have to go further out into the forecast here. So I'm going to take this ECMWF forecast until Wednesday afternoon. There's that trough now tomorrow over Oregon, portions of Northern California. Only weak returns here now over the middle part of the country. If I get into Thursday evening, can see some of that now getting into Idaho, eastern Oregon, the Treasure Valley. Better activity here even over parts of eastern Montana, the western Dakotas. If we take this into Friday, again, better coverage over Montana, Colorado, Wyoming. Through Friday evening, something through Wisconsin here, getting over into South Dakota, western Nebraska. And that activity all the way, you have to get all the way out to Sunday before you see some of this starting to move through like Illinois, through the northern plains here, eastern Montana, the Dakotas. Some question about the certainty of some of these precipitation values getting into like Illinois, eastern Missouri. I mean, this acre, we saw this at the beginning of this video, this has gone over very dry. And at least the ECMWF has been putting something down in recent runs through here as we've gone through at least like Sunday morning. We'll have to see how much of that comes through. You can even see here like into Monday evening as well. Perhaps some precipitation chances finally for portions of Illinois and Missouri. By and large, a lot of that precipitation staying over here in that forecast, even taking it a little bit further out. Finally starting to get maybe into like the areas like Iowa, Kansas, eastern Nebraska, northern Missouri, go through the middle part of next week as we have another trough coming through. But a lot of that precip, at least in this forecast, starting out in the western U.S. and staying across kind of the northern tier of the country until we get further into late next week. We see some precipitation chances return to this area here. We can see this in the 5-day precipitation anomaly. This just takes us into this weekend. There's Oregon, Northern California. We talked about that. Actually leaving western Washington a little bit drier. Snake River Valley as well, more so over near the Treasure Valley. Into the Golden Triangle of Montana. Some precipitation getting there. Eastern Montana over in the Dakotas. But by and large, drier here. So we approach the weekend, save for some, those weak showers that we're expecting over the next 48 to 72 hours. If I jump over, I might be able to pull up. Let's see if I have it here. If not, I'll just go over to AgWeather, weather maps. If you look at the Storm Prediction Center, their forecast over the next 3 days, there's that western Kansas panhandle threat today, but no kind of obvious areas of identification over the next 3 days thereafter that. And if you look at the excessive rainfall, no contours here over the middle part of the country, just staying out west in those areas that we talked about. And then Florida, continuing to see those daily showers and storms. There's the 5-day precipitation anomaly that we were just looking at. I'm going to take it out to 7 days. And again, as we get into the weekend and the next week, you can start to see early next week some of those precipitation values sneaking back into the Midwest. But by and large, still on the drier side, save for portions of the Dakotas, eastern Montana. If we take this a little bit further, 4 to 10 days, see the Canadian Prairie, coverage improving there, even eastern Washington, northern Oregon now. Start to see some precipitation here in northwest Mexico. Still drier here over in that Ohio River Valley. Now Florida going drier, New England staying drier, but we're starting to get, as we go further into next week, precipitation values inching further toward the southeast in this forecast track. Unfortunately, there's the 10-day. If we take it all the way out, still seeing this area here, anywhere from like Michigan through Arkansas, Oklahoma, East Texas, through the Carolinas, going over drier. I kind of picked on the driest corridor here, like right along the Ohio River Valley, looking at those NDVI values, where even there, in June, July, August, we were reaching up near record highs. They had the flooding earlier this year in a lot of these areas, and so we're actually low on NDVI values going through the planting window. When we did get a crop in the ground, those started to come up. But just over the last few weeks, you can see those dipping down, now below average, below where we were in 2024, which was a dry fall to begin with. And now we're seeing even dipping below that last year. I'm looking further into the forecast now. This is just the ECMWF AIFS. I'll start it here at the beginning of the forecast. Let's do there's 7 a.m. this morning. There's that trough that we looked at earlier. As I play this forecast forward, see that trough settle in over California, Nevada. The next 48 hours, bringing the precipitation to this corridor here, bringing some, weak showers and storms into the high plains by Friday. Now Saturday starts to get out into the high plains, so better precipitation coverage here. This weekend over the Canadian Prairie, this corridor here that we talked about. Rooting, hoping for something to sneak through here to get into the Midwest, some of the drier areas here, but there's some uncertainty whether that gets into Illinois or eastern Missouri. See another piece of this trough here now Monday, sneaking through the high plains again, bringing additional precipitation chances, and then by Wednesday and Thursday, at least that sneaks all the way over toward the Mississippi Valley. Another trough behind it, so there's our kind of best chance in this corridor here, later into next week, but it is weak, and it has this ridge to the north of it, kind of blocking better flow. So weak chances for precipitation, but you can see this going back over warmer thereafter late next week and some weak troughing coming in behind it. If we can build some ridging, at least here, maybe into the northwest a little bit later, could see some better precipitation get back into the desert southwest, maybe like a last gasp for the monsoon here going through the latter part of the month. But I don't see any like obvious, big time precipitation signals across the eastern U.S. The long range models support this. If we look at the ECMWF ensemble, I know it's hard to see that, so it's really small, but see general agreement from the AFS, the ECMWF ensemble, the GFS ensemble, and the Climate Prediction Center that Ohio River Valley, even stretching down into the lower Mississippi River Valley, like East Texas, across portions of the southeast, staying drier over the next kind of 10 to 15 days here. Where are we staying wet? Oh, I mentioned the southwest. There's implications here that I'm going to talk about. Eric might cover tomorrow on Wednesday and Thursday. We could have actually a potentially stronger storm coming up, weakening by the time it gets closer to the southwest U.S., but bringing some monsoonal-like moisture to the southwest from the eastern Pacific. But the winter wheat belt, in the forecast here we saw this, and now even out into the 8 to 14-day outlook, all the way from the Canadian Prairie, down the Continental Divide, staying wetter in September, kind of during that planting season for winter wheat. Looking further out into the forecast, we're right now seeing the MJO kind of at least weekly in phases 1 or 2 here. There's this kind of forecast jog where it's trying to take it back into phase 8. I think what we're seeing here from the MJO is one of these convectively coupled Kelvin waves where it's kind of a quick, jerky movement from the MJO. If we kind of jump over, we can see some of that. Let's see if I can pull that up in the Hofmuller diagram. So I'm looking at these green colors here in the forecast, kind of reorient ourselves. This black line across the middle, that's the present day. The green colors here are ascent in the atmosphere, kind of identifying that area of the MJO across the globe. Kind of a reference of where we're at in terms of the longitude is down here along the equator. We've seen a lot of MJO activity over the last kind of 4 weeks here, over in phases like 3, 4, and 5. You can see that here. But there's been these Kelvin waves that have kind of raced across. And we're in the middle of the kind of the beginning stages of one now here, September 9th. So as we go through the next week, this is going to be moving quickly into phase 8. You can see that in the forecast over the next kind of 5 to 10 days. So that's what we're seeing here in the forecast. As we get into middle part of September, like September 16th, racing all the way back over to phase 8. And when it does that, we could, by the time we get into like the 3rd week of September, as it gets into the Atlantic, see an uptick in tropical development. And I mentioned that storm in the eastern Pacific that might bring some of that monsoonal moisture, and that lines up well in this forecast as well. If we look at kind of our analogs for those MJO phases, I'm going to let's pull up phase 8 for like the end of September here. You actually see ridging across the Midwest, across eastern Canada, indicative of maybe some warmth returning to this area here, like we've seen here recently, like we've seen in the forecast. If I do jump further out into the forecast, let's do our forecast. We call these the postage stamps because there's the 9 of them here. But if we look 5 to 10 days, you can see a lot of the warmth sticking around Canada, the middle part of the country, and North America, the continent there. But as we go further into the forecast, notice eastern Canada, the Midwest. See this area going over warmer in a lot of these forecasts. That at least lines up with that MJO analog. And then if I take this, thought experiment further, I don't think, we stay in phase 8 or phase 1 for very long, even going to like early October, because that would keep a lot of that warmth around. This would be pretty wet for the upper Midwest, maybe even getting into the Midwest here. But I do think as we start to get through October, we probably, because of that background La Niña state, a lot of the green that we've seen sticking around here in August probably returns at some point as we get into the end of September, or beginning of October. I think we go back with MJO activity more so over here, just given that these are kind of quick Kelvin wave races across the equator here. And if we do that thought experiment, getting into October, like phases 4, 5, and 6, curiously, I'm going through like phases 4 and 5 in the early part of October here, or even like the middle of October. A lot cooler, and seeing more troughing here over the central and eastern part of the country. The ridging going back over northwest Canada, troughing staying here, which would be a cooler signal and drier, unfortunately, with that flow coming out of the north. Again, like sourcing it out of Canada, I think would be drier for that, unfortunately, that Ohio Valley or Middle Mississippi River corridor there. If we do fold back over into that more like typical fall La Niña state like we've been in August. And if we look at those long-range ECMWF precipitation forecasts and those values here, this is from the extended model. Unfortunately, just taking it like September 15th through October 15th or even further, we see this area staying drier in the long-range forecast, even parts of the plains and over into the continental divide going over drier as well. So that lines up, unfortunately, with that kind of La Nina fall analog. Lines up, even with the beginning of my video, the screenshot, the analogs that we looked at, even going into the beginning of August. And we just don't see enough right now to change that forecast. If there's been kind of any new signal here, at least going through this fall into early winter, it's probably come from the latest update from the ECMWF seasonal forecast. Eric talked about this quite a bit yesterday on Monday when he covered the latest update. What I'm doing here on the left, kind of a neat feature here, I'm comparing the new forecast, which is on the left. This is our most recent up-to-date ones. We're looking at precipitation anomalies in the forecast from September, October, and November, so the kind of 3-month rolling window. And on the right is the August update that we talked about last month. And kind of curiously, if you look September, October, November on the last run, wetter for like parts of western Washington, Idaho, Montana. Let's see if I can take that off. Look at how much wetter this latest forecast is here for the Pacific Northwest, even getting into like Northern California. And it's actually drier for much of the middle Mississippi River Valley, extending into the southeast Ohio River Valley. And we saw that same signal in that kind of MJO thought experiment that we just did for October here. So perhaps confidence shifting, unfortunately, for some of the drier conditions to continue. Favorable for harvest in some of these regions, but if it starts to impact the Mississippi River, we start getting field fires during harvest in some of these areas with some of the higher winds, perhaps later in fall, could also be an issue. But take the forecast further, we can continue this experiment. Let's compare this October, November, December, almost getting into the early part of winter here. And again, look at the west. Wetter through the northern Sierras. I'll take that brush off. I'll just keep it off there. Wetter through Idaho versus the last model update. Unfortunately, again, drier for much of the central or eastern portion of the continental U.S. And taking the forecast now, November, December, January, again, look at the shift. Wetter for California through the early part of winter. Even getting out like December, January, and February. I think this might be the last update that we had in August. Looks very La Nina, but with that range shifting further south, even like getting into Arkansas, East Texas, Mississippi now. This isn't something we can take as gospel, but the kind of trend in either direction is always worth watching. And then the latest forecast didn't have it for January, February, March, and August. But weather for the Pacific Northwest, wetter across the Mississippi River Valley and the Ohio Valley corridor as we go further into winter. Looks very La Nina-like, but the southern tier shifting a little bit wetter, not quite as extensive in those dry values here. And I think at least as it relates to like California, certainly always focused on La Nina years there for the potential for drought. What we might be seeing here, at least kind of comparing where we thought we'd be in August versus where we're at here in September. I just went, because we are starting to get a little bit concerned about the southern Sierras and the reservoirs there if we were to have another kind of dry water year starting in October, going through kind of next March or April. So I went back in the recent years and I picked all of these recently dry years for the southern Sierras as kind of a proxy for California precipitation, at least kind of the southern 2/3 of the state. So like 2022, 21's in there, 2020. I'll actually just show you all the ones I picked here. And all those dry years of the last kind of 25, you can see the ones I picked in there. The flurry of them at the beginning of this decade, the kind of what we call the blob years, 13, 14, and 15. There was kind of this big Pacific blob here. I think played a role in these. And when I plug those in, these are the sea surface temperatures that we get November through March during the water year. And what we can see here is a relatively textbook La Nina with the cool temperatures here in the central and eastern Pacific, warmth north of Hawaii, warmer here in portions of the Gulf. See some of that cool like post monsoonal flow here in the Indian Ocean. And by and large, this yields those drier years of the last 30 for California. But that's looking across the whole water year. We're just sitting here in September. So let's compare those years to what the sea surface temperatures looked like in the September before they occurred. And this looks a little bit interesting because it is similar in the North Pacific to what we have now. Look at Japan and the warmth stretching north of Hawaii all the way over to British Columbia. Compare that to what we see now. Very similar North Pacific pattern. Somewhat concerning for California. But what is interesting here is we're actually, not terribly cool in the central and even like the central western Pacific. To me, this looks like kind of the more beginning stages of a winter La Nina, where it kind of starts over here in South America and we start to pull some of these cooler sea surface temperatures west with those trade winds further into winter when they start to pick up. And if I compare that to where we're at this year, it does look similar, but we've already started that process. Eric and I have remarked extensively in the late summer period here how we've just kind of continued to have this background La Nina state. And And the atmosphere has been behaving, pretty La Nina here through the end of summer. That's why we have this drier fall forecast. And it's making me wonder if we are getting a little bit more stale with this La Nina. You can think of when you see a green light for a long time before you get to the intersection. As you get closer and closer, you're like, I know it's going to shift yellow here at some point. And that's not the best analogy, but that's kind of where my mind's going. Are we getting a little bit stale with this La Nina such that as we go through winter, we start to weaken out of it a little quicker? And if we look at some of these long-range forecasts, the latest ENSO forecast from the sea surface, those sea surface temperatures from the ECMWF, the same seasonal model we just looked at for this winter, some of these model runs, even like half of them, get us out of La Nina territory by February and March. The quicker this happens, the wetter I think we go over for portions of the western U.S., including California, Southern California, maybe the Colorado River Valley, which we know we're worried about this water year, given that we've started to shift drier in both those regions. And kind of curiously, I did go and look up the correlations between kind of the beginning of El Nino, which is, we call that El Nino 1.2, 1+2, kind of over in this region here near South America. And if we correlate late winter Nino 1+2 with precipitation, and the bluer kind of purple colors here are higher precipitation values in that correlation. So Nino 1+2, if we start to, deteriorate that La Nina to the point where we're starting to warm up those sea surface temperatures in the eastern central Pacific, that is a much wetter correlation for really the southern 2/3 of the country. So part of me wonders how much the sea surface temperature story is in this comparison that we did earlier. With maybe a quicker weakening La Nina, we start to get wetter for portion of the southern tier of the country, which has stayed drier in a lot of these forecasts. If we take the forecast from those sea surface temperatures all the way out to like February and March, starting to see the beginnings of that. Doesn't really come around until March, which could be a little bit too late in the water year, but that is a story I'll be watching, this kind of fading La Nina signature in the ECMWF. You start to see it like January, February, March. It's not uncommon for La Nina to fade around then, but if it happens a little bit earlier in like December, January, if we start to see that green light go over yellow, that's kind of the same phenomenon will happen with the vehicle that it does to our forecast. We're going to start putting a caution up and saying, so maybe something we need to reassess. I want to touch very quickly on the tropics. They're quiet right now in the Atlantic. We did have a wave that we were watching last week. It has dissipated in kind of the sea of Saharan air that's been over in the Central Pacific. I do think as that Kelvin wave comes over, like we talked about, see if I can pull that up quickly here, we will have more to talk about in that regard through the latter part of September, just in terms of those, the uptick in development potentially there. We were talking last week about Hurricane Kiko. It has deteriorated. It has no thunderstorm activity associated with it here this morning, save for like just a few on the northern fringe. And you can see it passing north of the islands of Hawaii here. It is still pretty close. So the rip current, the swells are a threat here along the kind of northern shore of the state here. So that will continue to be an issue. But in terms of like direct, precipitation or wind impacts to the state, fortunately, Kiko staying on the northern envelope of these scenarios here and not impacting the state directly. I'll leave it there today. Thanks for watching, and Eric will talk with you all tomorrow.